Hi everyone, this is James Tierney with TierneyEducation.com. I want to go over what we mean by a binding price control. You probably heard this in your introductory economics class, this term binding when it comes to a certain type of price control. When we say price control, we mean either a price floor, which we'll talk about these here in a second, or what we call a price ceiling. Now, we're not going to go into a lot of depth on these two, but we will show them both. So let's go ahead and let's just start with a price floor. So this page, we have price floor, and then I'll erase the stuff and we'll do a price ceiling. So we're going to talk about the concept of binding versus non-binding. On the left, we're going to do a binding price floor, and on the right, we're going to do what's called non-binding. We'll start with just our basic supply and demand model, where we have a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve. And let's just show where the equilibrium price would be. Remember, an equilibrium price is just where your quantity demanded would equal your quantity supplied. So it's going to be right where demand and supply end up crossing. I'm going to put QE and PE, QE and PE on both of these, just so we show this is the quantity at the market equilibrium. This is the price at the market equilibrium. Now, this is, in my mind, a very boring situation because the market just works and things are great. But what happens if the government comes in and sets a price control? What we mean by a price control is they're making some sort of law that says where you can or cannot set the price. So let's start with this concept of the price floor. By definition, a price floor is just the legal minimum of a price you can set. So an example of a price floor would be like minimum wage. So when we say the idea of binding, what I want you to think of with the word binding is that it has an impact on the market. Basically, we will be away from equilibrium if it is a binding price floor. And a binding price floor will always be above the equilibrium. And let's talk about why. This is a price floor. A binding price floor will be above the equilibrium because where does the market want to be? The market wants to be here at PE, but we are saying, the government is saying, you can't go below PF, the price floor. Well, at this price floor, if it's higher than my equilibrium, what we'll notice is the quantity demanded ends up being this level. The quantity supplied ends up being this level. And so up here, right, we have quantity supplied being greater than quantity demanded. So we should know that that's going to be what we call a surplus. There's too much of something. And the market forces should put downward pressure on the price to try and solve for this price floor. However, legally, we can't go any lower. So it gets stuck here at the floor, right? Think of the floor that you're on right now. You can't go below it. So this means it's binding and the price in the market ends up being higher than the equilibrium price. Now, we're not going to talk about consumer surplus, producer surplus, or the pros and cons of this binding price floor. We can leave that for a later video, but just how you show a price floor that is binding, it would be above the equilibrium and it causes a surplus, which is the difference between these 2 points. So what would be non-binding? Well, non-binding is if it were to be below. Like if this was your price floor, right? If we were below the equilibrium, let's call this the price floor. Well, the supply and demand are just going to get us back to the equilibrium. So what we end up having is we just end up having the price sit up here that's higher. So a price floor that's set below the equilibrium has no effect, has no impact on the market. So it is non-binding. Now you may think, well, a floor should be low. Well, remember, we're trying to have a floor that stops you from going below it, right? The floor you're on right now is stopping you from falling below it. That's what this is over here. It's binding. It's stopping the market from falling below. That's why a binding price floor is always above the equilibrium. All right, let's turn our attention to a price ceiling. Okay, again, we'll start on the left, just drawing our basic supply and demand, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, price and quantity on our axes. It's always good to draw things out over and over again so they become like second nature to you as you're taking an econ class. We'll label the price equilibrium and the quantity equilibrium. We'll do the same thing for non-binding. We'll set it up, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply. We have price and quantity on our axes, and where they cross, right, there's one price here that is going to get the quantity where quantity demanded equals quantity supply. Now that we set it up, let's talk about this idea of a ceiling, which is just my legal maximum. Can't charge above that price. An example, rent control. Sometimes we have rent control. We say you can't charge higher than this amount for, like, let's say low income housing or anything like that. Now for binding, again, sometimes you would think a ceiling's above you, but what is the ceiling doing? Like if I threw a ball up at the ceiling, right, it's stopping it from going above it. Well, if the market wants to be here, we have to put that ceiling, the binding ceiling, below. This has to be the price ceiling. Let's call this PC for the price ceiling. Because what happens if we set it here? Well, the market's unable to adjust. That's the whole concept. Notice this touches my supply curves. This is my quantity supplied. This touches my demand curve. This is my quantity demanded. And what that gets us here, the distance between these 2 points, right? Quantity demanded greater than quantity supplied. Well, what do we have? We have a shortage. A shortage always happens below the price equilibrium. I tell my students when they're trying to remember things, I say, well, look, this person down here would be a very short person if they're stuck here, right? That's why we get a shortage. That's one way I tell my students to remember that the shortage is below the equilibrium. And so what does the market want to do here, right? The market wants to have some upward pressure, right? If there's a shortage, we would raise the price to kind of, alleviate that shortage, but it can't. It's stopped by the ceiling. That's what we mean by binding again, right? It has an impact, it has an effect. So the price ceiling that's binding is going to be below the equilibrium. Now, what if we would have set that price ceiling above over here? Like if this was PC over here on the right, if this was my ceiling, well, I can still reach the equilibrium. This is where the market's going to want to be. So it does not have an impact on the market. It does not have an effect. So this would be non-binding. It's non-binding if the price ceiling is above. So there you have it. You can rewind this and look for the price floor, or this right here is the price ceiling, the difference between binding and non-binding. I'll make another video at some point that talks about producer-consumer surplus with price floors and price ceilings. We can talk about the pros and cons of price floors and price ceilings. But this is just a brief introduction of how you would figure out if a price control was binding or non-binding on a supply and demand graph. Make sure you comment below if you have any questions, subscribe, shoot me an email at james@tierneyeducation.com if you have any questions whatsoever. We'll talk to you soon.